Hi everyone, thank you for checking out this sample video from our High Yield Board Exam Review class. If you find this video helpful, please sign up for the live class. Thank you and good luck. So we're now moving to the lab portion of our review, and I'm going to start off with a high yield topic, which is thyroid labs. Almost certainly you're going to encounter a question that involves the thyroid because this is such a big differential diagnosis we encounter in psychiatry. And also because some of the medications we use in psychiatry impacts the thyroid, such as lithium. The first thing I'm just going to say is that these values are directly from the Purple Book. And I think many of you will notice that they are different from what you encounter in the hospital or in your clinical rotation. These labs look old to me. They may have been true 15 years ago, but the values are now in current clinical practice are different. For example, for LabCorp, the bottom limit for TSH is 0.45 and the upper limit is now 4.5. So just make that mental note that current clinical values may be different. For the purpose of this review, I'm still going to use the Purple Book values. So the first thing we're going to talk about is primary hypothyroidism, which is a big differential diagnosis whenever you see a client with a depressive clinical picture. So make sure that when you encounter a client with depression symptoms, you do want to think through if you need to rule out hypothyroidism as the medical cause of their symptoms. Similarly, when you encounter a client with manic or anxious clinical picture, you do want to rule out hyperthyroidism as a possible medical explanation of their symptoms. So in interpreting the labs, the first thing I always look at is the actual thyroid hormone levels. In this case, this client has low T4 or low thyroxine. That already should clue you in that this is a hypothyroidism case. Now, if the TSH is high, this tells me that this is primary hypothyroidism because the defect is in the thyroid gland. As you can tell, the pituitary gland is trying to compensate. It's trying to produce more thyroid stimulating hormone, but the thyroid gland is still not producing adequate levels of thyroid hormone. So the defect is in the thyroid gland. So that's one of my suggestions, which is if you're trying to differentiate primary from secondary thyroid disorders, you should ask yourself, is the defect in the thyroid gland or in the pituitary gland? So if the defect is in the thyroid gland, then that's primary. If the defect is in the pituitary gland, then that's secondary. So in the second example, we see that this client has high T4 levels. So immediately that should clue you in this is a hyperthyroidism case. Now, the TSH here is low, which tells you that the pituitary gland is actually working just fine because it's trying to decrease the TSH because it's detecting that there's a lot of thyroid hormone swimming around in the body, and it's responding appropriately by trying to decrease the thyroid stimulating hormone. So we can tell that the defect here is not in the pituitary, it's working just fine, but it's the thyroid gland itself that's producing a lot of thyroid hormone, and therefore it's a primary hyperthyroidism case. So let's apply these principles in these scenarios, right? For the first one, we see that the T4 is low. So immediately you should tell yourself this is hypothyroidism. Now, we can tell here that the pituitary gland is doing just fine. It detects low levels of T4, so it's trying to do more stimulating. So in this case, we say this is primary because the defect is actually in the thyroid gland. The pituitary is acting just fine. In the second example, we see that the T4 is low, and that should already clue you in this is hypothyroidism. In this case, the TSH is actually low. So the pituitary gland is actually not producing enough thyroid stimulating hormone to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. And therefore, the defect is in the pituitary gland, and therefore we call that secondary hypothyroidism. In this third example, we see that T4 is high. So immediately we should tell ourselves this is hyperthyroidism. And because the TSH is low, we know that this is appropriate. The pituitary gland, because it's detecting high levels of thyroxine, is responding appropriately by trying to decrease thyroid stimulating hormone. Therefore, this is primary because the defect is actually in the thyroid gland. In this last example, T4 is high. So immediately we say this is hyperthyroidism. And we can tell here that TSH is high. So the defect is actually in the pituitary gland. It's producing too much thyroid stimulating hormone. And the thyroid gland is actually just responding to the elevated thyroid stimulating hormones. That's considered secondary because the defect is actually in the pituitary gland. All right, so please review these concepts here because thyroid gland is a very high yield topic. It's probably going to be tested on. So moving now on to electrolytes. The high yield way to study electrolytes